All right, we're slated to deal with Daniel 3 and 4 today, 5 and 6 next week. And so you should have had questions, received questions on 5 and 6 for next time. We'll come to our questions here in a moment. One of the things that we need to keep before us every time we study Daniel is the theme or the message of the book, which is repeated almost in these exact words, but sometimes in principle, and that is that God rules in the kingdoms of men. And if we get that message from the book, then we've got the message of the book. That was the message that God was sending to Nebuchadnezzar, as we're going to see in chapter 4. We saw this in chapter 2, but today we're in chapters 3 and 4. And so we have 4 times that he makes this point. God rules in the kingdoms of men. God rules in the kingdoms of men. And over that point's being made. We'll see it again in chapter 5 next time. Here is our outline of the book of Daniel, 2 major sections. We're in the history section of chapters 1 through 6. We're still in the Babylonian period. That is the history of Daniel during the Babylonian rule before the Persians take over. And in that we're looking at point 3 and 4, that is Nebuchadnezzar's golden image in the fiery furnace, and then his dream about the great tree and Daniel's interpretation. The next week we'll go into the feast of Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall, and then we shift to a different period, and that is the Persian period. That's being in the lion's den. We'll get 5 and 6 next time. All right, let's first look at an outline of chapter 3, and then we'll go to our questions. Chapter 3 is about this image that Nebuchadnezzar set up, his golden image in the fiery furnace. 4 things happen here. The king made this golden image and commands everybody to worship. There's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The next section deals with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refusing to bow down. We learn several practical things there. And then 19 to 27, we see them cast into the fiery furnace and God delivering them from that. And then we see the king praising the God of heaven. We see several things about his nature, that is the nature of the king and his personality in that. Let's go to questions and then we'll come back to our outline. What was the size of this image? Question number 1. All right, which translates to, 90 foot tall and 9 foot wide. We'll come to that in just a moment, as exactly what did that entail and some speculation with reference to that. Question number 2, explain chapter 3:25. He saw 4 men, chapter 3 and verse 25, that he saw 4 men and one like the Son of God. Cast 3 in, and then the king said, didn't we cast 3 in? I see 4. And one of them, he said, is like the Son of God or the son of gods. Some translate, I believe the New American Standard says, or one of the translations says. And later he refers to that as an angel. Yes, who said that? All right, yes, verse 28. Good observation. Called an angel at verse 28. In other words, the divine presence. We'll come to that in a moment. Let's get question 3, and that's all on chapter 3. And what was the king's reaction to Daniel's 3 friends escaping from the furnace?
He blessed the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the house of you want to say anything bad about him?
All right. Yeah, he blessed the God of heaven, and then he made a decree. Actually, he did 4 things. First of all, he was amazed, verse 24. He blessed the God of heaven, verse 29. He made a decree that anybody who doesn't worship or doesn't says anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be destroyed. And then he did something else. Yes, he promoted them to a higher position. After ready to destroy them 1 minute, now he's promoting them to a higher position. If you don't already know this and hadn't picked this out, Nebuchadnezzar is quite fickle. He goes from one extreme to the other, and we're going to see that several times in our study today. Let's talk about the king making this golden image and getting things set up, and everybody's to bow down and to worship the king. It'd help if I had my Bible open to Daniel instead of Acts. I think that'll work a little better. So give me a second and I'll find Daniel. All right, in Daniel 3, beginning at verse 1, we have the king. They've been in Babylon for a while, I take it, because of, particularly by the time chapter 4 rolls around. We don't know an exact dating of this image here. This may have been earlier, but they've been in Babylon for a little while. At least the events of chapters 1 and 2 have taken place. That is, the children of Israel have been in Babylon for a little bit. But by the time we get to chapter 4, a good bit of time has passed, and we base that on Chaldean history. And we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 4. But be that as it may, he made this image and he set it in the plain of Dura, which is about 12 miles southeast of Babylon. The image is 90 foot tall. That's tall, and some people have a problem in visualizing the height. But sometime when you're outside of the building, look at the peak on this auditorium, and it's from the ground 45 feet. Double that. That's 90 feet. That's a tall image. 9 feet wide. Some are speculating, did that encompass the image itself, or did that also encompass the foundation and the platform on which it's set? I don't know. However, in 1854, archaeologists found a base about 12 miles southeast of the city of Babylon that they wonder if it's not the base of this idol. Do we know for sure? No, we don't know that for sure. But archaeologists have wondered if this could be the very base of that image that he set up. Be that as it may, he sets up this image, this large image, and he calls, verse 3, for all of the people he calls all the leaders, basically, is what verse 3 is talking about, without listing all of them. Calls all the leaders of the land, because the leaders then are going to encourage all the, for lack of better expression, all the underlings to come. Is that not true? And so what's the purpose? It's not specifically stated, but we saw this in principle, something that didn't happen with Rome back in chapter 2 and verse 43. What seems to be the purpose behind having everybody to worship this golden image? Yeah, exactly. It's to seemingly to unify the kingdom. If we have everybody worshiping the same God, if everybody comes and worships this God, we're unifying the kingdom, and that makes leadership on the part of the king or the emperor much, much easier. Rome tried that. It didn't ever work too well with Rome. And that's part of the purpose of the emperor worship, is when we get to the book of Revelation. They're trying to unify the kingdom. They never could. It didn't work. We see that in chapter 2 and in verse 43. All right, so verses 1 to 3, he builds this image and he has the dedication. Then verse 4, the decree goes out, and the decree says what in verse 4 and 5? When you hear the sound of the music in symphony, when you have all this music that is played, and when you hear that, that's your key that you're to bow down and worship this image. Not just acknowledge I've built an image and come and look at it and stand in awe, but you're to bow down and worship and give homage to this image. And it is an idol, it's a false god, but you come and worship that image. And then verse 6, there is the threat of the fiery furnace. That if you don't fall down, then you're going to be cast into the fiery furnace. Now verse 7 tells me something. What do you learn from verse 7? Peer pressure. You're talking about their faith being challenged, their faith being tested. One, it's tested by a command and a decree and a threat. But then there's the peer pressure. At the set time, when all the people heard that, there are people of all the people and nations and languages, that is, as Nebuchadnezzar has conquered other nations and languages, people of other languages, they're all bowing down. Everybody pretty much, everybody's doing it. Everybody's bowing down and worshiping the image. And you talk about peer pressure. Here's the pressure of the people, as we sometimes call it. So you look at the pressure that's put on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Where is Daniel at the time? He's not mentioned. I don't know. He's not with them when this is occurring. So did Daniel bow down? No. There's no evidence that Daniel would have done that, but he's just not in the picture. He must have been doing something else at the time this scene is taking place. Any questions on verses 1 to 7? Comments? All right, I'm wanting to get to chapter 4, so we're kind of pushing through as quickly as we can and yet try to do justice. This, after all, is a survey. Secondly, verses 8 to 18, they refuse to bow down. Verses 8 to 10, 8 to 12, rather, what takes place in 8 to 12? They went to the king and said, didn't you give this command? And yeah, I gave that command. Whoever doesn't bow down is going to be thrown in. Yeah, I did that. Well, there's some of the Jews that don't do this. And they're in your leadership. They're in your cabinet. They're working for you. And when the sound went out, they didn't do that. That's 8 to 12 now. Now, verses 13 to 18. Now, this gets interesting because he calls them in, since they're not just underlings out there in the field. These are men who are working for him. They're in his cabinet. They're in his administration. And he calls them in. What does he say to them? Verse 14. Is this true? The American Standard Version words it, is this on purpose? In other words, if that translation be correct, it may be saying, he may be asking, did you just forget to do this? Or did you do this on purpose? Is it just an oversight? In other words, he's kind of being a little bit lenient with him, giving him another chance. Instead of, you didn't bow down, I'm going to kill you. Is this on purpose? Is this true? Is this a false report that's been given to me? Did you do this on purpose? So at verse 15, he basically tells them, we're going to try this again. Sound is going to go out, and if you're ready, then bow down and worship. But if you don't, what happens? Cast in the fiery furnace. Look at the last phrase at verse 15. What does he say? Now this is interesting. Remember me saying he was fickle? Let's back up to chapter 2. This is the same king. This is the same king who back in chapter 2, after Daniel had interpreted his dream, verse 47, truly your God is the God of gods, the revealer of secrets. And this is the one who was impressed with this God of Daniel. Your God is the God of all gods. He's higher than any of our gods, and he's the powerful God. And so he asked the question here, who is the God that will deliver you from my hands? He praises God as being all-powerful, all-knowing, and then turns around and said, what God can deliver you? He's fickle. Now he's going to go back and forth all through our story today. Now at verse 15, we see their faith. So starting at verse 16, they stand firm and they don't bow. What do you see in 16, 17, and 18? Those three verses, powerful verses. Let's start with verse 16. They say, we have no need to answer you in this matter. What does that mean? They do answer him. Yeah, exactly. We don't need time to think on this. We don't need time to let us figure out what we're going to do. We don't need to come back to you again. I don't need to think about this. We're not going to bow down. Now, that reminds me of chapter 1 and something said concerning Daniel. What did we see concerning Daniel? He purposed in his heart. Long before he got to Babylon, he had already determined, I'm going to do what the Lord says. And so had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They had already determined. We don't need to answer you about this matter. O King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to answer you concerning this. Verse 17, if that is the case, in other words, you cast us in the fiery furnace, then, if you put us, the God, excuse me, the God whom we serve is able to deliver us, and he'll deliver us from your hand. So go ahead and cast us in the fiery furnace. Our God can deliver us, and we think he will deliver us. But what? Yeah, if not, then we will not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image that you have set up. Now, they didn't seem to care if they offended the king, did they? What else do you learn, practical, do you take home with you from 16, 17, and 18? All right, that's good. Absolutely. Good point. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Good observation. What else? Did you notice their answer was plain and clear and not vague? In other words, they didn't say, well, now, and when they got through, what did they just say? Some people are vague in their response to challenges to their faith. They were quite clear. We're not going to do it. Cast us in the fiery furnace. We'll be delivered. If not, we're still not going to do it. We're not going to do that. One writer said, most people can oppose an enemy, but it takes a special person to oppose a friend. They were, in some sense, a friend of Nebuchadnezzar. He had promoted them. Let's go further, beginning at verse 19 now. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are cast in the fiery furnace. Verses 19 to 23. Someone give me a quick summary of what happened in 19 to 23. Since they didn't bow down and they refused, he didn't wait and give them another chance. They just said, we're not going to do it. So the king's reaction was,
make the furnace as hot as possible. That's 7 times as hot as they can get it,
to the max.
to the max, and then put all their clothes on them, all their clothing to help, I guess, for the torment or to make sure they burn up.
Yeah. Yeah, make sure they're close because that'll catch quickly and it'll ignite and etc. So bind them in their coats and their trousers and their turbans and their garments and cast them in. So bind them together with all their clothes and throw them in the fiery furnace. The furnace was so hot, finish this sentence. The furnace was so hot that, the men took them and cast them into the furnace, into the mouth. Later mentioned to the furnace, they themselves were consumed and they were killed. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall down into the furnace, and there they are. Now then, immediately, the king notices something. Look at verse 24. He arose and he spoke with haste. And what did he say? Didn't we put 3 men? And I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like, now your translation may say the Son of God. And you say, well, obviously that's Jesus. Remember, capitalization is supplied by translators. And so the term God may be God, capital G. Some translations talk about Son of Gods, plural, Son of the Gods. It's some form of deity there. But later, I think it's a reference to some angel because, let's get ahead of ourselves, at verse 28, he later calls this that God sent his angel. Well, God did that at times. For example, we see that in the New Testament in Acts chapter 5. God sent an angel to deliver Peter. We're going to see later in chapter 6 some reference to that in Daniel. But God would send an angel, some heavenly being, some messenger from heaven to deliver them. So to make this Jesus himself, it may be. But I have no evidence that it's Jesus himself. But a heavenly angel or a messenger sent from God to deliver them. He saw that and said it is the Son of God or the Son of Gods or an angel.
How would Nebuchadnezzar know
Yeah.
what Jesus looked like?
Yeah. So I don't think that he's saying, I see Jesus, the Son of God, but I think he's saying, I see an angel, I see a heavenly being. Because they had been saying, God will deliver us. And he takes notice of that. Now, beginning at verse 28 now, they're delivered from the furnace. They come forth from the furnace, verse 27. He called for the men to come forth, verse 26 and 27, to come out of the midst of the fire. And they come out of the midst of the fire. Notice at verse 27, what did he notice particularly about them?
They did not even smell like smoke.
Yeah, their clothes weren't burned, they were not burned, and they didn't even smell like smoke. Something is unique about this. So here's his reaction. Verse 28, let's get his reaction. He praises the God of heaven, but notice he praises their faith. 3 things about their faith. Let's see if we can find them. Verse 28. He spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel to deliver his servants. Here's a statement of faith. Who trusted in God. Is that true? Yeah, they trusted in God. They said so. Here's another statement concerning their faith. They have frustrated the king's word. What does that mean? Say again? Made him angry. That's true. Yeah, we can frustrate. There's an expression of frustrating the grace of God, disregarding and putting it aside. So they frustrated the king's command, meaning pushed it aside. So here's a statement of their faith. Number 1, they trusted in their God. Number 2, they frustrated the king's command. Would you frustrate the king's command? What if the government told you to do something contrary to the will of God and they're threatening you with jail and everybody's bowing but you and a couple of your friends? Pressure's on. Are you going to frustrate the king's command? There's a third statement. They yielded their bodies that they should not serve and worship the God except their own. In other words, they're willing to give up their own life for their faith. You want to talk about faith? Nebuchadnezzar just described 3 descriptions of their faith. They trusted in God, they frustrated the king's command, and they yielded their bodies that they might serve the living God. So what was his decree? Let's finish up with the decree and then we'll go to chapter 4. What was his decree now?
Anyone speaks against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be torn limb from limb.
Isn't this fickle? He praises the God of heaven, chapter 2, and then he said, what God can deliver? And as soon as they are delivered, anybody that speaks against this God is going to be killed. Well, we're not done. He's going to go back and forth again. Quite a fickle character. May explain part of his problem at the end of chapter 4. All right. Before we leave chapter 3, I want to share with you Homer Haley's outline. I borrowed this from him as I heard him teach Daniel. He gave this outline orally, and I copied it down and have preached this several times. The faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their faith was challenged, their faith was declared, their faith was tested, their faith was vindicated, and their faith was triumphant. That makes a good study. Good sermon outline, and I credit Haley with that. All right, let's go to chapter 4 now, and let's talk about chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about another dream Nebuchadnezzar has, and of a great tree, and Daniel's interpretation of that. So we have the dream, we have the interpretation, we have the fulfillment, and now Nebuchadnezzar praises the God of heaven. But before he gets to that, we're going to have another episode of him being fickle and praising himself. And so he is this fickle character that we've been describing. All right, let's get a question 2 out of the way. What was Daniel's explanation of the dream? We haven't talked about the dream yet, but no, we do. We need to get question 4. What was the dream? Okay. Yes. It is this great tree that's cut down. We'll get to more details of that in a moment. And a stump is left or a root is left, and then it becomes a human and then acts like an animal. And so this is anything's possible in a dream. Anything's possible in a vision. We need to remember that principle as we get into visions later in the book and in Ezekiel and in Revelation. In a dream or a vision, anything's possible. The impossible becomes possible. And so he has this vision. Now then, we have the interpretation. Question number 5, what was the interpretation? He is the tree that is cut down, and he's going to act like an animal and be humiliated. Anything else? The root was left because he's coming back to the throne, and he does. All right, let's work through this. Pretty simple discussion, and we're going to learn some powerful things. If you're so disposed to underline or highlight and mark, get your instrument to do that, because we need to highlight some things as we go through that have to do with the key to the book. Let's talk about the dream. This chapter is different than the other chapters. It is, as you start the chapter, you say, wait a minute, this sounds like Nebuchadnezzar is talking. And it is. Basically, the chapter is a letter that he wrote after all of this is over. The Septuagint translation, Pulpit observes that the Septuagint translation translates verse 1, the beginning of the letter of Nebuchadnezzar. So this is a letter that he seemingly sent out throughout all of his province after he he gets over the problem. And he said, here's the background of this. Here is the back picture to all this. Here's how this all led up to my becoming crazy and basically going insane. And then when I came to my senses, I'm back on the throne. Here's the explanation of all of that. All right, so let's get this. Here's the dream. He starts off acknowledging, now this is post everything. He's writing this after this is all over. So he starts off acknowledging God and that he's great in signs and wonders, his kingdom is everlasting, etc. And then beginning at verse 4, he said, I was troubled by a dream. He doesn't tell us yet what the dream is. But I had this dream and I was very troubled about it. So verses 6 to 9, I sought men to come and help me and interpret this. They couldn't do it. So I went and found, look at verse 8, Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar. In other words, I gave him that name. According to the name of my God. We talked about that. He named them according to their gods to try to get the Jewish religion out of them. But in him is the Spirit of the Holy God. And I called him and told him, I know that you have the Spirit of God in you, and so you can explain and give me the interpretation. Now, what's different about this dream and interpretation as opposed to chapter 2? Exactly. So in chapter 2, he said, you've got to tell me the dream and the interpretation. This time he tells the dream to Daniel. And so here's his dream. Let's get the dream, and we're more interested in the interpretation. But here's the dream. There was this great tree, he said. And it grew and became so high that all the ends of the earth could see it. In other words, it was a gigantic tree. All took notice of that. It provided fruit and for all and food for all, and it had shade for the beast and nests for the birds. And he said, I saw in my vision a watcher, a holy one coming down. I take that to be an angel of God or at least a messenger of God. It's all the best we can do with that. And what did the messenger say, verse 14? You might underline this. Chop it down. Yeah, chop down the tree. And you're to take that, well, I've done turned the page, and nevertheless leave a stump and roots in the earth. Don't dig it up, but cut the tree off and leave a stump and a root. And then bind that with iron and bronze. And then notice the shift. This is possible in a vision. And that is, that stump, let it be wet with the dew of heaven. And then here's, notice the shift, let him graze with the beast. And on the grass of the earth, and let his heart be changed to that, from that of a man into the heart of an animal. And let 7 times pass over him. The idea of 7 times, I think, is complete. Some commentators say maybe that's 7 months. Some think it may be 7 weeks. Some think it's 7 years. Others think it's 7 periods of time, maybe periods of time within a year. I don't know. It's just 7 times until God determines it's over, is all I care about. So notice that shift. This tree that was cut down suddenly becomes a man who acts like an animal. You say, well, a tree can't turn around and become a human and then act like an animal. In a vision, it's possible. All things are possible in a vision. I've given this illustration before in talking about how things are possible in a vision. I had a dream one time my horses got my neighbor's ladder and climbed up on top of the house. And I know that can't be true. My neighbor doesn't even have a ladder, so that doesn't work. So some things that are impossible are possible in a vision. All right. Now, being at verse 17, still talking about this vision of the great tree, he said the decision and the decree, here's what he learned in the vision. What did he learn? This was done in order, get ready to highlight or underline, you need this. Yes, and gives it to whomever he will. God rules in the kingdoms of men. Underline that. That's the highlight of not only the dream, that's the message of the book. This is what Nebuchadnezzar needs to see. This is what we need to see. That's what the people in captivity need to see. God rules in the kingdoms of men, gives it to whomever he wills. Now notice he doesn't say God rules in his kingdom. That's true. God rules in the kingdoms of men. So let's fast forward and put that in present day. Does God rule over Russia, China, U.S., Mexico, wherever? He's ruling in all kingdoms of men. All right. Now, beginning at verse 18, he said, I had this dream and I'm not able to know, and so you can tell me, Daniel, what this dream's all about. All right, that's the dream. Now, verse 19. Verse 19 says, Daniel was troubled by this. Now, why was Daniel troubled? Yes, I don't think Daniel's troubled because he can't figure it out, because Daniel has already interpreted dreams and is wise, and he knows that God will give him the answer. But he was astonished for a time, and it troubled him. And what he says at verse 19, he said, my Lord, may the dream concern those that hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. It doesn't concern his enemies. What he's saying is, I'd rather this dream, as I tell it to you, be talking about your enemies rather than talking about you. But I'm going to tell you, it's about you. I see now some faith in Daniel. Daniel speaks, what we call it in politics, when an underling tells the boss truth to power. Here's truth to power right here. So he says, beginning at verse 19, the tree that you saw. Let's get ahead of ourselves. Verse 22. Here's the end of that sentence. The tree that you saw, it is you. That's what this is all about. That tree is you. And this one that said, cut it down, verse 23. This was done look at verse 24. This is the interpretation, O king, that the decree of the Most High has come upon my Lord the king. This is talking about you. And they will drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be among the beasts, and make you eat grass like oxen. And you'll be wet with the dew of heaven, until you know. Now get ready to mark and underline. What do you see at the end of verse 25? Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. We're not through with that phrase. We've seen it twice already. We saw that principle in chapter 2 and 21. So we're seeing God rules in the kingdoms of men. He said, that's what this dream's all about. For you to understand and for you to know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, gives it to whomever he chooses. Now let's get verse 26 and 27 before we leave that. Inasmuch as they gave a command to leave the stump, what's this all about? Yeah. Inasmuch as you gave the command to leave the stump, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know. Now underline, mark this again. Here's the next phrase. The whole phrase is not there. Until you know what? Heaven rules. Some translations put God in place of heaven. That God rules. And that reminds us of a phrase that says, God rules in the kingdoms of men. So that's 3 times in this story we've seen God rules in the kingdoms of men. Lest we not get to this when we get through with the chapter, let me stop and footnote. I'm wondering if we really have that concept fixed in our minds, that God rules in the kingdoms of men and God is in control. Evidence? During election season, we get all excited. I'm talking about among Christians. I'm not talking about the world. I'm talking about among Christians. We get all excited that this one is going to get in and that one's going to get in, and Christians are divided as to which party they want to be a part of. And I'm not here to talk about political things, but I saw this more in the 16 cycle, where I saw as I traveled among brethren, Christians were just terribly beside themselves. If Trump gets in, the end has come. Or if Clinton gets in, the end has come. And I wondered, do we not think that God still rules in the kingdoms of men? An amen would have been good right there. Thank you. Now look at verse 27. Because that's true, here's what you need to do, Nebuchadnezzar. What does he say? He doesn't use this word, but we would use it. Repent. That's what he's telling him. He said, break off your sins and by being righteous and your iniquities by showing mercy, and perhaps may lengthen your prosperity. See, God's promised you can come back to the throne. You're going to go through some trying times, and you're going to act crazy is what you're going to be doing. And you're coming back to the throne, but what you need to do is repent, because you need to learn God rules in the kingdoms of men. All right, that's the interpretation thereof. Now then, let's have the fulfillment. Now this is this fickle king again. So what does he do at verse 28? 12 months later, it's been a year. He's walking about in his palace. And what's he doing, basically? Bragging and strutting around. What does he say? Yeah, is not this the kingdom, the great Babylon that I have built by my mighty power and for my honor and my majesty? And while he was still speaking, what happens?
Voice up from heaven told him that your kingdom is departed from you.
Yeah. In other words, you remember the dream I caused you to have? Your kingdom is now gone. And they'll drive you from among men, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen until 7 times have passed. And till you understand, here we go again. Get ready to mark, underline, highlight. Till you know. What is it? All right, so if you ought to have marked for future study, for future reference, verse 17, verse 25, verse 26, and verse 32. 4 times we've seen the Most High, or God, rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whomever he wishes. Now then, at that very hour, what happens?
He was driven from the men and ate grass like an ox.
And his body became wet with the dew of heaven, and his hair grew till it was like eagle's feathers and nails like bird's claws. Now, it didn't say he had bird's claws or eagle's feathers. Some have drawn pictures that he had feathers and he had great claws. The text says it was like unto that. Now, what's going on here? Did he become an oxen? Did he become an animal? No, I don't think so. There are conditions, and I just want to briefly introduce this idea. There are conditions, mental disorders, that cause people to think they're animals. Boanthropy makes one think they're like an oxen or they're like a cow. And studies have been made, and in fact, you might, if those of you who have Dan King's commentary, he gives a quotation when in 1946, a doctor studied a man who thought he thought he was some kind of bird. And he was in a mental institute, and he ate like a bird. He wouldn't eat the food in the institute, but he would go outside and eat, and he'd get up in the trees and roost in the trees. And he described this mental disorder that makes them think they are animals and they behave like animals. And so you might consult. He gives several references to that. He goes much deeper than I have time to go. Now, my understanding is that the Chaldean history suggests near the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign that there was claims of his mental disorder, that he had mental problems and he had great problems mentally. Well, this would fit. Thinking he's like an ox and he's got grazing. Now, what makes me think that's true, that there was a mental disorder? Let's look at 2 phrases. Look at verse 34. This is now when he comes back to himself and he praises God. There's 2 phrases. He said, my understanding returned to me. There was a time he didn't have understanding. He did have it, he lost it, and it returned. That can happen with mental disorders. One can have a clear mind, they can have a mental disorder, and then they get a clear mind. And then the next phrase was, at verse 36, when my reason returned. Those 2 phrases. So let's get this quickly and we're done. After his reasoning returned, he praises God. Here's this fickle king that had just sometime before, how long? 7 times have passed. I don't know how long that is. But he had been boasting, and now what's he saying concerning his God? He praises and honor, and I praise and extol. Look at verse 37 to end this. I praise and extol and honor the King of heaven and all the works he's done, and those who walk in pride he is able to abase. In other words, he brought me down. He humbled me. This humbled me. I now know God rules in the kingdoms of men. And that's the letter he sent out. This is the king that sent this out. And let all the province know this is what went on with me. This explains kind of what happened to me. Well, that's chapters 3 and 4. We're done. Chapters 5 and 6 next time.